Hello, everyone. My name is Teresa Homsi, and you're listening to the special Earth Week podcast series where we talk sustainability. I'm joined here today with Dr. Matthew Liesch to discuss environmental sustainability. Dr. Liesch, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Teresa?
I'm good. I'm excited to have you here, and I'm excited to kind of dive into what we're talking about, and we're going to continue talking about throughout this entire week. So I guess let's start with some introductions. Kind of what's your background? What do you do? Who do you are?
I've been at CMU for 10 years now, and I'm a professor of geography, department chair of geography and environmental studies in Dow Science Building on campus. And I've always been interested in how humans interact with environment and how we shape the environment, and also how the environment shapes us.
Right. Well, something that I've been asking everyone, all of my guests so far, is what does sustainability mean to you? So that's my first question.
Yeah, for me, sustainability, my own kind of definition of it is using resources carefully and thoughtfully, so that way those resources and resources very broadly defined are there for future generations for an indefinite period of time. And so for me, then sustainability is mainly an ethic of how we try to live our lives. And none of us live our lives perfectly sustainably. It's just something that, I see it as a goal to strive for with what we can do.
Yeah, that's something that I've heard. Unrelated to this series, I've heard people talk about how it's not something that we've yet achieved, but it's a goal. And so I've never heard it be described as an ethic before, and that's a very insightful perspective that I've noted here. So what originally got you involved in sustainability, and how did you sort of get to where you are today?
That's a good question. I don't have one watershed moment of thinking, hey, I was trying to be involved in sustainability like it was some sort of new trend, but rather, I suppose it was part of the educational system growing up. When you hear about, hear about recycling, hear about less impactful ways of commuting to work, hear about different ways you can, grow your own food and other things. So there wasn't really one watershed moment as much as it was probably the result of a wide variety of communications over the years, and then thinking about what the earth looks like for future generations.
Where are you originally from?
I grew up in Wisconsin. Probably the easiest way for podcast listeners to have a general sense of where I'm from is probably about 90 miles north and northwest of Chicago. And I grew up in a rural farming community, but had lived in a variety of different places over the years.
Mm-hmm. Usually when people talk about like how they got involved in something, oftentimes it connects back to where they grew up and the environment that they were brought up in and what the things that they sort of noticed. So I was wondering if you kind of see that in yourself.
Yeah, definitely. I think growing up, paying attention, like my first job ever was on a farm. So paying attention to soils, paying attention, you'd see after a spring rainfall, see topsoil that erodes away, has you thinking about soil conservation and sustainability of the soil. Growing up, spending a lot of time near lakes and forests, and seeing forests that had been logged over in the early 20th century now have trees that are 80 to 90 years old in many cases, while seeing some trees that hadn't been logged over. Going on a walk and making those kinds of observations about forest cover change really helps, at least help me growing up, think about how the human role in shaping forests is. And I mentioned lakes, similarly, just how, I've always enjoyed thinking about the ways in which we organize our landscapes, whether it's of our yards, whether it's of a park, and how parks are managed, but also how the shorelines of lakes can appear as far as to what extent there's wildlife habitat or not. And And so just thinking about the cultural role in shaping these landscapes to me is something I always found interesting when being out in a boat or being out in the water, and seeing like, well, that there's obviously different outcomes when it comes to, see, you're watching loons or an eagle, and where are they going to seek out fish, where are they living, and seeing how there's big differences from one riparian or really shorefront environment or space to another space. And so seeing the role of human decision making, to me, was just always kind of making observations growing up in different places that I was in, and kind of seeing the good, the bad, and the ugly that way.
Every time that I have spoken with you, you always bring up going on walks. And so it's just something I've noticed. And, I don't know, it's just, would you say that going on walks is something that has been a consistent thing throughout your life, and it has, it's a time for thinking, and it's informed a lot of your decisions and your outlooks on the world?
I guess I never really had thought, hey, I really make these decisions out in the world by going for walks. But for me, I've always been an observer, whether it's of landscapes, observer of human behavior. And so I think going out and being outside is a great way of having the time and the space to go and make kind of observations about how humans structure their landscapes and places. From a spatial standpoint, why are some things where they are? Why are other things not where they are? And then so there's a lot of interesting questions about human environment interactions, and the topic of today's sustainability that come through, going on a walk and seeing how in some parts of the United States, you find neighborhoods where compost bins or compost piles are the norm. And it's almost as if it's a peer pressure effect. If one person has a compost bin, other people learn about it, and other people then turn around and get that in the same neighborhood. Or there's some neighborhoods where solar panels are very common, whereas there's other communities where you don't see them at all. Bike racks and forms of bicycle commuting. You find that there's a lot of interesting geographic differences with regard to some of the decision making we make with environment. And that's something that's easier to note on a walk, at a slow pace, versus if I'm making observations when I'm driving down, an interstate. But it's just that you don't have as much time to focus on details the same way.
I wasn't trying to make a walk any super important, sometimes a walk is just a walk, but it's just something that I've noticed the theme that comes up with you. And so I was wondering, the outside element is probably important. So to kind of bring things back, I invited you to represent sort of environmental sustainability. And through the week, I'm inviting different people who represent, different types of sustainability. So what does that distinction mean between, just sustainability and environmental sustainability? Why do we make those sort of distinctions?
That's a good observation. Oftentimes, I think when the general public thinks of sustainability, I think at least the general public in much of, but not all the United States, might just think about environmental sustainability and equate that with sustainability in general. But as you allude to, there's different forms of sustainability, and while you can look at sustainability as a whole, sometimes we find it's easier to break things down in knowing that they're interconnected, but break things down into different smaller parts. So you might have someone who's really interested in cultural sustainability or economic sustainability of how do you keep an economy, or what's local or global, going for a longer term time span than just the short run. So all these different forms of sustainability involve thinking about longer term horizons, but I think it's useful to think about environmental sustainability as a concept by itself. Some cases, in other cases, it's useful to think about it in tandem for think about the whole system overall, cultural sustainability, economic sustainability, et cetera.
And those things often overlap too.
Yes.
So that's something that we're trying to bring through in this series. It's a mini series. It's only 5 episodes, but that's like a huge portion of kind of the message. So just how they overlap. I see you shaking your head. So if you have anything to say,
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense. It's a case where every single thing that we could possibly study, we can try to study in isolation. but then we have to recognize how things are connected. And it's kind of like if we took if we took a history class, we could go and study, here's post-Civil War history of the United States. But then it's like, sure, you can just study that in a 3-credit class, but you have to know that things are still connected, that what happened, prior to that time, what happened outside the geographic area that's being studied is going to, interface with that. So there's pros and cons to looking, I think, at any kind of subset of sustainability in isolation by itself, just given the connections that you point out.
It's also difficult to look at it holistically as well, because that can be a little bit too broad and a little bit too vague. So, with environmental sustainability, generally speaking, I would agree with you. That's what most people think sustainability is. They think reduce, reuse, recycle. They think, wind turbines, solar energy. But, that's kind of what sustainability is. It's this kind of little ideal utopia world where everyone's like riding bikes everywhere. And so I guess when we make those kinds of assumptions about what sustainability means, is there any sort of, I guess I just use the word assumptions. I was trying not to use the same word, but are there, when we think of sustainability in that way, what sort of assumptions that we make about that can be misplaced?
I guess to me, one of the biggest things I'd want to point out with assumptions and sustainability is we oftentimes find it easy to focus on specific kind of hot topics within sustainability. Some certain things are flashpoints, and they're useful to look at and to galvanize support for more sustainable measures. Whether it's about resource use, I know like recycling is always kind of a hot topic that way. But there's also a lot of things that I think fly under the radar with regard to sustainability that don't get emphasized as much because we focus on certain things. So to me, I guess I really see one of the goals for sustainability in the future is to be able to look at resource use in a holistic sense, what we use, what we need to use, and just look at everything overall that way.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier that your sort of focus when it comes to the environment is about human impact on the environment. And something that I've noticed when we talk about sustainability as just kind of recycling, it's always recycling for me. That's just what I've seen. Everyone always, recycling is the first thing that comes to mind as far as associating it with sustainability. But there's kind of a distancing between the environment and the human. Is that something that you've noticed, from your work and your research, just on public perceptions here?
Yeah, definitely. And that's something that my students and I have been discussing this semester in ENV 350, Foundations of Environmental Thought class, where some of our readings take a look at this kind of false dichotomy between the human world and natural world, that we'd say, hey, nature's out there, nature's at this park, nature is, some of those grand scenes we see on an old school wall calendar where month by month there's a picture of mountains or beaches or rainbows or whatever else. But like nature is in our yards. There's natural processes in our yards. It's incredibly heavily disturbed ecosystem in general. But one of the bigger critiques about how the environmental movement sometimes sees nature in the past, it was in the 1990s, more scholars were saying, hey, let's not just look at these wild spaces as far as the priorities for preservation. Yes, we need to do that. We also need to look at how we're living our lives in places like central Michigan or elsewhere on a day-to-day basis, because there's a lot of environmental impacts to how we structure our lawns, how we commute, etc.
Yeah.
And that's something that my students have found very interesting to discuss this semester in ENV 350 as well, because it just kind of shapes. It doesn't tell students what to think. It's more just it shapes how we think about the environments in ways that we may have not thought about before, and that we do traditionally, oftentimes in kind of Western environmental thought, have this distinction between the human world and natural world.
As an environmental studies student myself, I remember when I first learned of nature as a social construct, that was very, I mean, it wasn't like mind blowing, but it did shift a lot of things into perspective. And unfortunately, at least from what I've seen, that's limited to those kinds of classroom settings. And so how do you think is the best way to get those sort of conversations in the public discourse, in the public eye, where more people are able to engage with this sort of material?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of smaller conversations that happen here and there. I don't think in general it's, especially, I think oftentimes it's easier to have some of these smaller conversations incrementally than to say, hey, yeah, you need to be more sustainable. Well, that's the people that the message might be well intentioned, but it won't necessarily you say, hey, you have to do, these 50 things right off the bat. That might not be as fruitful as doing a bit here, here and there to say, for example, like Isabella County Conservation District, they have native, tree sales. That's one of an ensemble of many, many different things that we can, as community in Mount Pleasant and in Central Michigan, that people are using, having more, plantings that are well adjusted to the climate, the soils, growing seasons of Central Michigan. And so that's only one thing. That's a microcosm of all these other ways in which we think about conservation efforts at home, and in addition to some of these iconic kind of case studies or things that come to mind when it comes to environmental sustainability efforts. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a process, and probably a never-ending process, but it's a process, and there's a lot of, I think, room for a wide variety of conversations.
Yeah. That list that you're talking about, Eric and I and Lindsay from facilities have been, facility management, have made a pledge, a sustainability pledge, where people can pledge, I will use less water, that list that you're talking about was the 50 things. And so I don't want to be critical of my own project here, but I see what you're saying in that by itself isn't very, it's not really informing people on kind of the root, it's like the tip of the iceberg, it's bigger underwater. And so that's interesting. And it's making me think of that pledge that we just released here. So,
and I do think like a list like that pledge is very comprehensive, and really I haven't seen that pledge, so I wasn't even referring to that specifically. But it's a case where even that 50 things, that's great in the sense it's more than just, than just a couple of iconic things like recycling or something else. We obviously want to, there's room for more recycling in the United States, but it's when you think about all our different interactions with the environment, between the resources we use, between how we organize our living spaces, both interior and then our landscapes outside, and you could, you really could make a list of 500 things probably, but to me, what's I think is important to keep in mind is the communication style of how do we get, if people want to have more sustainability, more efforts for sustainability, how can we, in a positive way, get more people to buy into those goals? So I think communication strategies are, being reflexive about it is very important in trying to popularize, environmental sustainability efforts.
Mm-hmm. Along this line, I guess, who do we need to get involved in sustainability?
I would say anybody and everybody. Certainly there's, there's different messages for different people. Again, going back to the role of communication, seeing it as an ethic. While there's definitely needs to be room for policy and large scale management, there's also room for individual decision making about the environment, especially to say, because you could have the world's most well-crafted policy, but if it's still not going to have people buying into it, from an ethics standpoint, the policy won't necessarily be upheld, on an individual basis. So while there's room for policy and management, I think there's always going to be kind of an educational role whether it's at CMU, K-12, or just informal educating we do when we talk with our neighbors and friends about, different forms of environmental trade-offs.
Mhm. Yeah. And hopefully this podcast can be just another one of those, I guess, more informal sorts of communication that we have. I guess to sort of wrap up, I just wanted to ask you if you have any sort of final thoughts or things that you'd want to add to this conversation.
Yeah, I'm trying to think with probably a lot of students at CMU listening to this. I think there's a lot of future leaders listening to this podcast, and over the course of your lives and careers, there's no shortage of environmental decisions that get made. And with that, there's always, again, I see sustainability as a process you're trying to get to that I'll never know if it'll be fully achieved, because we all use, environmental resources. We all have human needs and wants, and with that, just trying to look at sustainability in a broad sense, ask what's going on, like both locally and globally. It almost sounds cliche to say local and global, but just as we need conservation of biodiversity hotspots, we also need conservation efforts right around our communities with sustainability in mind. And I think it's going to be one of the kind of the big picture lasting issues for generations of current and future CMU students, as we're changing environments, as we're changing climates, as we're changing soils, and you could go right on down the list, changing landscapes. How do we become more sustainable and more resilient? I think resiliency is a buzzword that will be increasingly becoming a buzzword over the next generation, as we've seen that we are changing, environments in different ways. This will be a challenge for current CMU students when both currently at CMU and then in the future. And so thinking kind of broadly and holistically about the impacts that our decisions make will help us lead to a more sustainable future than, say, the alternative of not doing anything.
Yeah. To people who are listening, I guess, where would you recommend they start? Just diving into this.
Yeah, one of the best ways, I think, is to start having conversations and I think sometimes I'm always big into getting people to kind of question their assumptions, about the world. As I see that part of my role as an educator, where I'm not trying to tell people what to think. I'm just trying to tell them, I just want to get people to think. And so for me, it's always just outside of even sustainability, just good to get people to be reflexive. By that, I mean, question what we think our assumptions are. And so some of that can involve even just like looking around, our homes, our yards, the way in which we pay, we look at our bills, what are we paying for in certain ways? And I think that, helps question assumptions like, well, do I really need the lights on at this time? Or do you really need to, drive when you were going 6 blocks away, that kind of thing, and you could walk or take a bike or something else. So I think just questioning our assumptions about stuff with a mind towards, education. And I think that's part of the role of having, sustainability within curriculum, the K-12 level and college level, as well as, different forms of, outreach in community.
Questioning your assumptions sounds like a good activity to do while on a walk. So just to bring that full circle here, I guess final question here. This is just something that I've been asking all my guests so far, to get a good summary of the conversation. What are some main takeaways? If we're to summarize this whole thing that we've done, main takeaways, what would you say they were?
Main takeaways: think broadly and holistically about sustainability, as well as today's topic, or this podcast topic, of environmental sustainability. But there are obviously other forms of sustainability, such as cultural sustainability, and recognize that while we all may have a slightly different personal definition of sustainability, we're part of it is trying to see how you conserve resources in the short run, so that way future generations of people, plants, animals, etc., can all have those resources available. And I think that there's this large role for education, questioning assumptions, thinking and learning.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time and your insights and your perspectives. Something that I was always unsure of how to sign off on these. But when my last podcast, I've come to an idea, and that idea is just a reminder that it's cliche, but it still needs to be said. Every day is Earth Day, so that's kind of how we're ending these on that note. Every day is Earth Day, and unless you disagree, but if you disagree, I'd love to hear it.
I totally agree. I think the Earth Day ethic is probably best thought of as something that is every day rather than like an event or a holiday, because then thinking of that as a one-off event annually in late April, then what are we doing the rest of the year? And much the same way that if you separate the concept of humans from the concept of nature entirely, nature is out there. Nature isn't the songbirds in the backyard, or nature isn't the tree growing in the yard. If you just say, hey, nature is somewhere else, I think these kind of keeping things separate, a lot of scholars have argued, well, it leads to some false, dichotomies that way.
Yeah.
So Earth Day is every day in a sense.
Earth Day is every day, yes. All right, well, thank you.
Thanks, Teresa.